I had the pleasure of serving as the director of the National Park Service and subsequently a member of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And it has been my pleasure to participate in the 3 webinars, and this is the 4th, focusing on the general topic of preserve the past and build the future, with a major emphasis on the rich and enduring legacy of African Americans who have made a substantial contributions to the development of our nation, starting and even perhaps before 1619, when 20 odd of my ancestors arrived on the shores of Virginia. And we know the history that evolved from that point on in terms of today's challenges, both socially and economically, for the benefit of all our people. This evening, we are honored to have 2 distinguished scholars and practitioners in the field of preservation to address us on the topics of African Americans and historic places that commemorate and preserve their legacies, that's not only represented in the national parks, other public lands, but in the private sector as well. So tonight, we will hear again from 2 excellent speakers who will provide us information on 2 aspects of preservation. Again, preserving African-American historic places. And I should emphasize that over the course of my 50 plus years being involved in historic preservation, I cannot thank these practitioners and Susan and Lynn and other members of her staff for their devotion and their hard work in bringing to us these 4 webinars. And they live and breathe preservation day in and day out, not only for the benefit of our generations, but for the benefit of future generations as well. And again, one of the outstanding practitioners in the field who will speak to us now is Jaime Loichinger. She is the Assistant Director from the Office of its Federal Agency, Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And she will relate historic sites and the Section 106 review process that is required by the Historic Preservation Act of 1966. She will be followed by Ms. Jobie Hill, a preservation architect whose work centers on saving homes of enslaved persons throughout our country. She is also working on oral histories, another way that we can preserve the memories of the past. The work of both of these outstanding ladies, these outstanding practitioners, is critically important to memorializing the past and telling the full and true story of the history for the benefit of us better moving as a nation towards realizing the democratic values of our way of life. We would hope that you will see the connection and the intersection between these things you are interested in and these observations. Ladies and gentlemen, let me hand the program over to Jaime, and she will subsequently introduce our distinguished guest, who is now in our. Jaime, all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. And quite honestly, I don't think I realized that my career in preservation would have such lofty goals as you laid out there. I think when I got this position, I was just happy to have a job as a graduate student, but certainly grateful for the career that preservation has brought me. I'll go ahead and start by saying 2 things. One, I'm going to sincerely hope that the bandwidth of my internet allows me to keep my video on for this part of the presentation. It's been a little touch and go here in Baltimore today. And I also live right on a main thoroughfare, which is where the fire trucks come through. So I will mute myself if any sirens start along the way. But in any event, it's great to be with you all here tonight. Glad to have a chance to talk about Section 106 and how that might be a tool for recognizing and preserving sites of African American historical importance. Going with the idea that probably most people don't know about Section 106. It's not a law that most people are super familiar with. But as Mr. Stanton noted, Section 106 is found in the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, and it lays out the federal government's national preservation program, how the federal government can be a steward and a leader in the historic preservation field. Section 106 itself is a 4-step review process where federal agencies consider the effects of their actions, their activities, their undertakings on historic properties. Undertakings encompass a lot of different things. It can be as big as the Federal Highway Administration building an interstate, or Federal Railroads Administration building a new rail line. Or it can be as small as rural development, giving a grant to an individual farmer to support, conservation activities on their land. All of these are undertakings where the federal agencies involved have to think about whether there may be historic properties affected by those actions. Section 106 is interesting because it doesn't mandate an outcome, it mandates a process. Again, it's the idea that an agency is considering how it might affect a historic property. When Congress originally enacted the legislation, it was with the idea that if agencies knew what they were doing, that if they were informed about the effects of these actions, that it would result in better outcomes, not just for historic properties, but for the agencies in achieving their missions. The ACHP is unique. We're one of the only agencies that our only mission is historic preservation. For all of the other agencies out there, they have to kind of weave in this idea of a historic preservation ethos into their missions for national security, affordable housing, natural resources conservation, rural development, all of those kinds of things. So the 106 process essentially is intended to create an opportunity where you can bring in agency mission, preservation values, and really what's in the public interest when it comes to historic preservation, to hopefully arrive at an outcome that, either preserves a historic property, finds a new use for it, or, maybe we say goodbye to it. It no longer has a use or place now, but we can find mitigation that kind of offsets that loss. The ACHP a few years ago, as part of our 50th anniversary, did a big effort to identify 106 Section 106 success stories. And those were meant to show the full range of outcomes under Section 106. And if you have a chance to go to our website and take a look at them, you'll see they really do cover the gamut of, in some cases, full loss, in some cases, full preservation of a historic property, and then everywhere in between. So it's interesting to take a look at that, and also to learn about maybe agencies that you didn't know about. There are a lot of federal agencies out there that maybe we kind of forget about or weren't aware of. The ones that I'd like to kind of highlight for you tonight are I have two that I'm going to talk about. The first one is Fort Leonard Wood out in Pulaski County, Missouri. And that actually was a Section 106 case that involved the Army. Fort Leonard Wood is owned and maintained by the Army. A building on that particular campus had fallen into disuse and disrepair. It hadn't been used for many years. And the Army was trying to find out what to do with it. Originally, at the time, they had put it forward for demolition. However, within that building, I think it was building 2101, was a mural that was painted by Samuel County, who was an African-American soldier that had been stationed there.
Jaime, I think we've lost your audio. Can you check it? We may have lost you.
It obviously had a lot of importance. It was also, that particular building was also a Black Officers Club, a particular property type that is unfortunately more endangered year by year as these buildings
Hi, everybody. It's Lynn Richmond. I think Jamie's having some audio problems.
Actually, one of Mr. County's own relatives, I believe it was his granddaughter, was able to participate in the Section 106 process to have input about what happened to her relative's mural. Ultimately, through that process, the consulting parties were able to convince the Army to reconsider its demolition plans and find a compatible long-term use. In 2018, the Army went ahead and started rehabilitating that particular building that allowed the mural to be removed for restoration, temporarily displayed within the installation, and then bringing it back to be reinstalled with the appropriate, But ultimately, this particular project won one of the ACHP's Chairman's Awards. We offer those, I think, about once a year to a project that has an outstanding preservation outcome. So as part of that, we usually put together a brief video that lays out the history of the project and the significance of the property. And I thought that it might be interesting to share that with you all tonight so you can see actually the mural because it's completely stunning, but also to get a better sense of the Section 106 process. So Lynn, if I could ask you to put that video up on.
Building 2101 was one of the original buildings constructed in 1941 when Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri was established. It was a time of segregation in the U.S. Army, and the building was reassigned in 1942 as the Black Officers Club for the 7th Engineering Training Group. Staff Sergeant Samuel A. County, a black soldier stationed at Fort Leonard Wood, was already an established artist and art instructor prior to his military service. He painted dozens of murals and other paintings at military installations both in the U.S. and abroad, including a mural in Building 2101 depicting a man and a woman relaxing under shade trees. The work is believed to be the only surviving piece from County's military career. Building 2101 was determined to be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places in 1998. However, in 2011, the Army decided it did not need the building and it sat vacant with only minimal HVAC supplied in an effort to preserve County's mural. Several options for the building were being considered, including deferred maintenance, mothballing, rehabilitation, relocation, and even demolition. In 2012, Fort Leonard Wood entered into consultation with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, Missouri State Historic Preservation Officer, National Trust for Historic Preservation, Pulaski County and Rolla NAACP, Missouri Preservation, and Sammy Whiting Ellis, Sargent County's niece, a vocal advocate for preservation of the building. The consulting parties were animately opposed to demolition of one of the last remaining World War II-era Black Officers Clubs. Working together, an occupant was identified, and it was determined the building would be converted into a classroom, meeting, and social space. The mural would be preserved, and repairs would be made to the 1940s-era stonework masonry features built by German prisoners of war. The rehabilitation of Building 2101 began in 2018, and a ribbon-cutting ceremony was held in August of 2019, which was attended by ACHP expert member Robert Stanton, Miss Whiting Ellis, and other members of Sargent County's extended family, and Building 2101 was dedicated to Staff Sergeant County as County Hall. The consulting parties used the Section 106 process to strongly advocate to preserve the building and find a compatible use. Building 2101 illustrates how historic properties can be productive assets to an installation's mission, as well as a venue to tell a cultural history and support the larger national significance of the African American military experience. Its preservation and continued use will provide countless opportunities to tell the story of African American Army officers during World War II to future generations. The collaboration, perseverance, and the passion for telling this important story through preservation of the building and the mural are the reasons that this project is being presented with the ACHP Chairman's Award for Achievement in Historic Preservation.
So yeah, I made a note in the chat just a minute ago. I'm sorry that I misspoke earlier when I said that Ms. Whiting Ellis was Sargent County's granddaughter. It was his niece, but nice to see Mr. Stanton featured in that video. So, but you know, certainly a preservation success, but brought about largely because of the Section 106 review, which can be really powerful for advocating for historic properties that may not be known, and you know, it's certainly a tool for advocating for properties that are significant to the telling of the African American history here in America. So certainly looking forward to some additional questions from anybody there at the end. The other one I wanted to mention, and I'm not sure where everybody's located tonight, but if any of you are in New York City, you have an amazing opportunity to visit a national monument. The African Burial Ground was designated a national monument by President Bush in 2006. And that was another Section 106 case. Back in the early 90s, the General Services Administration, they're the federal agency with the largest property. They're kind of like our landlord. They were going to build, I think it was a 34-story federal building. It was meant to replace an old one. They started building it and had originally concluded the Section 106 process with a finding of, I believe, no adverse effect or no historic properties affected. They'd done a very cursory look at whether or not there may be historic properties or historic significance in the area and determined that wasn't the case. Ultimately, when they started digging for such a large building, they started uncovering burials, the discovery of human remains. And it was anytime you discover human remains in any project, it's obviously deeply significant. And there's lots of state and local laws that have to be followed. But in this particular instance, when folks started doing additional research, GSA, along with their consultants, and actually reaching out to other neighborhood consulting parties who had been involved in that area, who knew the historic significance of the area, they uncovered what was originally known as the Negro Burial Ground. It was the burial ground for the original enslaved people that had been brought to New York as part of the slave trade. And it was in operation from approximately the mid 1600s to the late 1800s, of huge significance for the community there, who know that that's where they're descended from. They have relatives that were part of that. So the Section 106 process offered an opportunity, though, for the community to have direct input into what happened next. You know, what level of maybe academic research might be done on those who had been uncovered, who, you know, what repatriation might occur, and what that ceremony would look like to bring people back to their resting place. Because it was so deeply significant, that was why the president, using the Antiquities Act of 1906, was able to name it as a national monument. So if any of you are able to go today, you can see where there's an external memorial showing, you know, some of the remains that were originally dug up as part of GSA's original construction, how they were reinterred back into their final resting place there. It talks a little bit more about, obviously, the practice at that time, and serves as an educational point for people to learn more about what was happening in those times, in the early 1600s especially. And, you know, you obviously have the benefit of having the National Park Service itself do some of that interpretation and provide those educational opportunities. So in one respect, not a success, because you never want to uncover human remains. You never want to disturb anyone's final resting place. But on the other hand, for the community to have the information about their ancestors, for there to be this monument telling this part of our history that is challenging and complex, there is a success there. You can kind of maybe have to tilt your head and squint your eyes a little to see the success, but there's something to be said for the educational value and for the community to have such a direct input into what happened there and how it continues to be maintained today. So Section 106 can be a really powerful tool to creating community-based solutions and ultimately decisions made by a federal agency that reflect their input. I will go ahead and turn it over to Ms. Jobie Hill.
All right, thank you. I will share my screen. All right. Thank you. So my name is Jobie Hill, and I'm a licensed preservation architect with a background in archaeology and anthropology. My personal mission is to advance, okay, there we go. My personal mission is to advance an evidence-based understanding and acknowledgement of the institution of slavery in America. A cornerstone of this effort is the belief that the histories of many non-white Americans have been told to them and not by them. To that end, I am dedicated to the interpretation and preservation of the living and working environments of enslaved people, integrated with their own oral histories and historical records related to the business of slavery. My professional work to date has been the documentation, preservation, and interpretation of slave houses. I started an independent project titled Saving Slave Houses to ensure that slave houses were not lost forever. One of the most important components of Saving Slave House project is the Slavehouse Database. The Slavehouse Database represents a comprehensive national architectural and anthropological study of slave houses in the United States. It is designed to be a resource for researchers, descendants, museums, organizations, and the public to study and interpret the surviving evidence of slavery, and to serve as a way to preserve and study the important but largely lost slave house. For my research purposes, a slave house includes all enslaved spaces in which housing was one of the functions. It's very common for enslaved people to work and live in the same building. This was especially true of kitchens and wash houses because these services were always in high demand. The Slavehouse Database has two parts: documentation and interpretation. The documentation is a visual representation of the spaces, and the interpretations are descriptions of the spaces from the actual inhabitants who lived and worked there during slavery. The architectural drawings and images of slave houses represent snapshots in time. In this context, slave houses are considered artifacts, and like all artifacts, they can convey important messages about their makers, occupants, and uses. The most direct way of getting at an accurate interpretation of the uses, activities, and feelings associated with historic slave houses is through the accounts left by formerly enslaved people themselves. The narratives recorded from formerly enslaved people breathe life into the two-dimensional drawings and photographs of slave houses. My research involves examining both the historical record and material culture. I've completed over 700 architectural and anthropological surveys of enslaved spaces across the US. In addition to fieldwork, I've conducted extensive research and detailed analysis of the materials in the largest collection of documented slavery architecture in America. They are the interviews collected by historically Black colleges and universities in the late 1920s, the slave narratives collected in the 1930s, the architectural surveys completed by the Historic American Building Survey since 1933, the Virginia Historical Inventory Project in 1937, and the research and documentation carried out by the Architectural Research Department at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation since 1980. Having seen firsthand hundreds of slave houses, as well as studying them from an interdisciplinary perspective, I'm able to offer an exclusive perspective about the structures and inhabitants of slave houses. The Historic American Building Survey, or HABS, was a government program established in 1933 for relief employment under the Work Progress Administration, or WPA. HABS was able to employ 1,000 qualified architects and draftsmen to record historically significant buildings of the United States. The purpose of the survey was to obtain a complete record of the architectural features of the buildings. Photographs were intended to supplement the measured drawings and not to serve as the only form of documentation. But for 60% of the slave house sites, a photograph turned out to be the only type of documentation. Only 14% of the HABs documented slave houses have both a measured drawing and a photograph. The Virginia Historical Inventory, or VHI, is a collection of photographs, maps, and detailed reports documenting the architectural, cultural, and family histories of thousands of 18th and 19th century buildings across Virginia. The project was created in 1937 by the Virginia Writers Project, a branch of the WPA. Unlike HABs, which documented prominent historical structures, the VHI was specifically charged with describing the vernacular architecture and history of everyday buildings built before 1860. The VHI created architectural descriptions of 396 slave houses. Of these, 28% also have a photograph. A bonus feature of this project is that during 8 surveys, they also recorded narratives from formerly enslaved people and photographed 2 of the women seen here. Extensive research on slavery has been conducted by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, or CWF, over the decades. Since 1980, the Architectural Research Department has been actively conducting architectural surveys and historical research of enslaved spaces as part of the Agricultural Buildings Project, making it one of the largest collections of documented slave houses. The vast knowledge of the architectural historians and the immense level of detail put into the drawings and reports makes the collection at Colonial Williamsburg unparalleled. I was awarded the Fellowship in African and African American History and Culture from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation for 4 years in a row. For my fellowships, I worked with the architectural historians to digitize the entire Agricultural Buildings Project collection. I scanned over 5,000 measured drawings, field notes, photographs, and written reports. CWF has surveyed over 700 US sites. Of these, over 200 sites have an enslaved building. The interpretation portion of the database includes descriptions of the slave houses and the activities that took place there from the actual enslaved people living and working there during slavery. The largest and most widely known collection of narratives is the Federal Writers Slave Narratives Project. The Federal Writers Project, a WPA program, was established in 1935 and was designed to provide jobs for unemployed historians and writers. One of the assignments for the Writers Project was to collect American life histories from people of all backgrounds. One type of narrative that was of great interest to John Lomax, the director of the Writers Project, was the interviews from formerly enslaved people. In 1937, the official Slave Narratives Project was created. At the end of the Slave Narratives Project, more than 2,300 first-person accounts of slavery and 500 Black and white photographs of people once enslaved in the US had been collected by the Writers Project from 17 states. Black scholars have always been at the forefront of collecting and telling African American history in the United States, even though their work often goes unrecognized for decades or longer. Without them, some of the greatest scholarly works would have never even come into fruition, such as the Federal Writers Slave Narratives Project. One of the leaders in the systematic collection of oral histories from formerly enslaved people was John B. Cade. While working at Southern University and then Prairie View State College, Cade conducted around 500 interviews in more than 17 states. Just recently, a collection of narratives at Southern University became available online. The original 1929 set of narratives, which was compiled at Southern University, was destroyed according to a letter from Cade on February 13, 1935. The newly available set of narratives is the 1935 Prairie View State College collection. The collection contains 229 narratives from 17 states. Of these 229 narratives, 121 describe their house during slavery. So the next couple of slides, I'm just going to have you read on your own. And what they are responses from each of the two different, interviews. And when you're reading them, I want you to, one, note how they tried to record the dialect. It will also give you an idea of what it's like to work with each of the collections. And also you'll see that the WPA questions invoked responses that describe the building, while the Cade questions tended to get responses that were more emotional. So the next couple of slides is just read them on your own. Slavery was different for every single person who experienced it, free, freed, or enslaved. There are broad patterns and similarities between daily life of the enslaved from one site to the next. But in order to truly begin to understand the human dimensions associated with slave houses, one must carefully consider the descriptions given by someone who actually lived and worked in these buildings. Narratives from formerly enslaved people provide insight into the uses, activities, and feelings associated with the historic slave house. Details that fuse a voice about the human condition with the physical structure. The anthropological history, in combination with the preservation of the historic slave house, reveals a part of history that cannot be gleaned from the historical record alone. My methodology, which I call In Their Own Words, is able to identify the ex-slave narratives that describe a specific documented slave house. In this context, the house where the person lived during slavery is the same house that is featured in the image. Of the 485 HAB sites with a documented slave house and the 1,010 Writers Project narratives that describe their house during slavery, only 5 documented slave houses from the HAB's collection can be directly linked to an ex-slave narrative recorded by the Writers Project. My favorite example of the 5 matched sites is the Taylor Plantation in Alabama. It is a rare HAB site that can be matched to the ex-slave narrative of Jane Holloway. This site is also exceptional because not only is there a narrative about life in the Taylor Plantation, but a photograph of Jane was also taken during the interview, and it survives. This site and Jane's interview provide insight into the lives of enslaved people on a small plantation. During slavery, Jane lived with her mother, Carrie, her father, Taylor, and her brother, Maryland. Jane and her family lived in a one-room log house. She remembers that the room itself was not very big, but the fireplace was. Recalling the large fireplace made Jane think of spending time with her family, the meals they ate together, and how precious these times were for her when she was growing up. The Slavehouse Database also includes new current documentation for each of the slave houses. This documentation represents survey work that I have completed and will continue to do. To date, I have completed surveys of approximately 700 buildings at over 150 sites across 7 states and have driven over 9,000 miles. The HABS collection has been the primary focus of my research thus far. Therefore, it will be the first collection that I complete survey work for. This phase of the survey work involves locating and resurveying the HABS documented slave houses in the United States. I should note that when I am in an area, I survey as many sites as I can, not just the HABS sites. The goals of my survey work are 1, to identify which of the HABS documented slave houses still exist. 2, to document the current conditions of the surviving structures. 3, to record architectural information that is missing from the original survey and record any additional buildings that were not documented during the original survey. And 4, to collect GIS coordinates for each structure. For myself, fieldwork provides a perspective that can only be gained from personally interacting with and experiencing a space. There's no substitute for standing in a house and experiencing the overwhelming rush of emotions that comes with it. And this slide is just an example of how people have many different definitions of what a restoration is. On the top left is the 1971 HABS photograph. On the top right is a photograph taken by the property owner before they were getting ready to restore the slave house. The bottom left is what it looked like when I got there about 2 weeks later. And then on the bottom right is what the structure looked like after it had been restored. Having a physical space to experience and interact with is one of the best ways to help people grapple with some of the complexities and harsh conditions that slavery imposed. Unfortunately, many people won't have the opportunity to experience this in person. 66% of the sites I've surveyed are privately owned. 27% of the structures have been demolished, and another 5% have been abandoned. So soon they too will disappear from the landscape. But with the use of technology and continued determination, the story doesn't have to end here. Technology not only plays an important role in the documentation process, but also the storytelling process. I use technology to explore the intersections between the built environment, history, humanities, community, and storytelling, with the goal of yielding captivating educational digital humanities projects. Appreciating the landscape of slavery through the perspective of the enslaved community takes time and practice and must be done on a holistic level. This means approaching it with an open mind and a willingness to let go of preconceived ideas and beliefs about the people who built and lived in these structures. It also requires the ability to accept grim and sometimes vile truths. True insight about what life was like for enslaved people can only be gained by examining how and why enslaved people made decisions, and above all, accepting their mechanisms to survive oppression. For example, history's definition of a slave owner is a person who owned or enslaved another human being. But to an enslaved person, a slave owner was also a slave breeder and trader. If a slave owner at any time forced an enslaved person to reproduce, or if a slave owner profited from an enslaved woman, an enslaved female having a child, then he was a slave breeder. And if a slave owner at any time sold or bought an enslaved person, then he was a slave trader. You didn't have to be breeding or trading enslaved people by the hundreds to bear this title. Committing this moral crime only once earned you this label. Slave owners were not shy about expressing their interest in and belief that they had the right to control the reproductive rights of and schedules of enslaved women. At Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm. What she produces is an addition to the capital, while his labors disappear in mere consumption." The Massey family of Pharsalia Plantation in Nelson County, Virginia, kept a stockbook, which documented the details of over 350 births from enslaved women spanning more than 100 years. And at Green Hill Plantation in Campbell County, Virginia, Samuel Pennell was so proud of his slave breeding and trading activities that he built a stone slave auction block and auctioneer scene right outside his front door. It is these historical accounts and the psychological trauma they inflicted on enslaved people that we must remember when interpreting the landscape of slavery in slave houses. We must also remember and learn to recognize that for each action made by the slave owner in an attempt to control, there is also counteractions of resistance made by the enslaved. Enslaved people were given inadequate resources with which to build their dwellings. This was a way for slave owners to assert dominance and dehumanize the enslaved community. Close examination of extant slave houses reveal that enslaved carpenters knew how to build their houses so that aesthetically they were within the accepted social hierarchies of slavery, but at the same time they were inconspicuously constructed with the finest craftsmanship to ensure that their legacies would live on. Enslaved builders incorporated survival mechanisms into the architecture, discreetly showed off their unrivaled carpentry skills, and left behind personal signatures. Enslaved people controlled only the details of the architecture, not the master plan. Therefore, in order to learn about the people who built them, worked in, and lived in these structures, we must focus on the details. They use the details in a building as hidden messages of resistance, strength, and perseverance. These details reveal that a slave house is a complex, irreplaceable piece of history that embodies suffering, yet perseverance, and strong family bonds. I believe the most telling detail of any slave house is the fireplace. Fireplaces epitomize the complexities of enslaved people and slave houses. First, they remind us of how fragile and precious human life is. And second, fireplaces represent a sacred space where women provided nourishment, clothing, warmth, and comfort for their families. The relationship between the historical record and the stories of the inhabitants is crucial to our understanding and interpretation of the lifeways and settings of enslaved people. Extant slave houses provide an opportunity to directly interact with irreplaceable pieces of history and experience some of the harsh conditions of slavery and the perpetual forms of resistance firsthand. In order to walk in the footsteps of enslaved people and gain new perspectives, we need to let the narratives from formerly enslaved people guide us along unfamiliar paths and trust that in the end, they will bring us greater insight and empathy. What is also missing from contemporary interpretations are the voices from descendants of enslaved communities. Conducting interviews with descendants of enslaved communities will be a key component in understanding the culture and survival strategies of these overlooked people. Lately, my work has been focused on working with descendants. This summer, Saving Slave Houses and Virginia Humanities is hosting the inaugural Virginia Black Public History Institute, which has brought together a multi-generational group of slavery descendants with ancestral ties to 5 Virginia historical sites. The Descendant Workshop participants and interns are exploring public history through weekly readings, virtual roundtable discussions, hands-on learning, and engagement with professionals, policymakers, and government officials. The interns are also assisting with conducting research and working with the participants to complete collaborative projects. The ultimate goal of this first of its kind hybrid workshop is to promote equitable co-stewardship of Black ancestral sites statewide by equipping descendant communities with cutting-edge scholarship, tools, and other resources, and a national support network. This workshop is laying the foundation for what future partnerships between descendants, historic sites, and organizations should and can look like. It is also a pipeline for future collaborative Black public history projects. To learn more about my project or contact me, please visit my website. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both Jaime and Jobie. We are really lucky to have women like you doing the work you do to help us preserve these important places. So I think we might have a couple of questions, and I'm just going to go ahead and get them started. I actually was fascinated by what Jobie was saying about the narratives and the responses to the interview questions. Jobie, are those documents available to the public to look at, either
Yes.
digitized or?
Yes, both. Actually, there's now 3 collections, but yes, they're all available to the public. So the WPA collection is available through the Library of Congress, and the Cade collection is available through the library at Southern University. And Southern University actually just released another unpublished collection just like 2 months ago of unpublished WPA narratives from Louisiana.
Okay, so that's the Library of Congress and the Library of Southern University.
The library at Southern University.
Okay.
I think it's the Cade. It might be the Cade Library at Southern University. It's the name of the library. I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, it's the library at Southern University.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think Tom Kaufman has a question he would like to ask. Tom, do you want to unmute and ask?
Sure. Thank you. Jobie, I'm in such tremendous admiration of you and your work. Thoroughly enjoyed your presentation and learned so much. I wanted to ask on the Taylor Cunningham House in Lauderdale County, Alabama. Is that site accessible? Is it possible to visit even by appointment or?
I'm not sure, and I have not actually been there yet, and I'm not even 100% sure it survives, to tell you the truth.
Oh, okay.
I'm still doing more research on that, because there are two different sites. That family had what they call the first house and the second house, and so I'm trying to get clear about which one, if either, still survives.
I'm so glad that you presented it, because now I'm interested. I wouldn't interfere with your work at all, but if it was, something you could see from the highway, I would be interested. And many times when I'm driving in Alabama and I see structures very similar to what you've presented, and I hate to admit, I just didn't think that they would be former slave quarters or houses. But that's very possible, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Tom. So Maya, you're on, and I think your second question about the public and the community members is a great one for Jaime. If you would unmute and go ahead, and if you want to turn your video on, that's great, and ask your question. I think Maya's on. Okay, well, I'll ask it. Jaime, how can the public and community members help save these histories and special places?
So, obviously the 106 process provides a unique opportunity for members of the public to become involved in the federal decision-making process. You know, again, Section 106 is unique that way. Not a lot of other federal laws provide for public input, but not necessarily having a more active role in the conversation. So you can always kind of look around and see if there's a Section 106 review going on in your neighborhood. As I noted, I mean, there are at least 200 federal agencies, and all of them are working across the country. There's a lot happening. So if you see a cell tower going up in a sensitive area, you should probably be reaching out to the FCC, or, you know, if you see, you know, community development block grants in your neighborhood, go ahead and ask around about, you know, within your city, who's distributing those funds, and have they thought about how it might affect historic preservation, and, you know, how can you participate in meetings about them? So, you know, start asking questions, you know, start with your local officials, and then figure out the agency and go from there. The ACHP is around to help too, you know, so you can email us. We'll try to get you in touch with the right people, or direct you to a website in some cases. You know, we don't know everyone, but we do what we can to get you the information. So
Jaime raises a really great point, because things are happening all around us. And if we don't ask questions, we won't really be able to affect the future of these places. There are a lot of local preservation organizations that are also involved. So as Jaime says, if you see something or you hear of something that you find interesting and you're wondering about it, go to your state historic preservation officer's website. You can look them up under their acronym, SHPO, State Historic Preservation Officer, and be sure to get involved. It's a good thing to be involved in your community. Here's Maya again. Maya, you just put in a more recent question about the future of preservation. Are you able to unmute and ask your question of perhaps both Jobie and Jaime?
Yeah.
You can turn on your video too if you'd like to. It's completely up to you. We can hear you.
Okay. Really for anyone, what encouraged you about the future of preservation of enslaved spaces, of the Is there anything that's going on right now that gives you hope for the preservation of these spaces?
So Maya cut out a little bit on a key phrase there, the future of preservation for enslaved spaces, the history of slavery, etc. So I will toss that out to both Jaime and Jobie. Thank you, Maya.
So I can kind of respond to that first. So I'm very optimistic. And a lot of that has to do with, like I said, lately I've been working with descendants of enslaved communities. And you guys, the public can also see this, but they're descendants of enslaved communities and enslaved spaces are now actively engaging with historic sites and are making an effort to get their voices heard and participate in the interpretation and the decision making that's happening at these sites, because it is the sites of their ancestors. So they're starting to feel and feel empowered, and that's a good thing. And so the work I'm doing is hopefully helping them do that. So I am very optimistic and excited about how the changes that I'm seeing happening. And so I think it's only going to get better from here on out. So.
And you know, I probably have a slightly different perspective, because I see obviously just preservation from all the agencies and across the country, and you know, the telling of so many different communities, you know, and seeing what's important to them. So you know, I can't necessarily speak to one story, but I will say, just me personally, I've been really encouraged by, I think, the willingness to have these conversations about our real history, you know, to open the conversation up to something that is challenging for people to wrap their minds around, to learn how to speak about it with respect and compassion. I think you just see a lot in, for me lately, at least with the agencies I work with, you see a willingness to embrace the real story and not the sanitized story. And I think that does give me hope.
And I will also say, kind of on that note, a lot of institutions and organizations are reaching out to me more. So I know from their side, they are also trying to make an effort, and you know, they want to know, what do we do? Like, how do we get, you know, communities and descendants and others involved in telling these stories, because it is new to everybody, because it hasn't been done, and so they don't know what they're doing, right? So they're like, what do we do? How do we do this? And you know, and so, which is good, right? So it's going to be a learning process for everybody, and it's not going to be fast. It's not going to be easy, and it's going to take a lot of listening. And so that is what I tell them, you know. And so, and even just like the first conversation, they're always like, oh, okay. They're like, we kind of knew this, but not really. That it's going to be a lot more kind of work and time than kind of what they expected. So, but it's good. At least they're asking about it. So that's also encouraging.
Yeah. Co-sign all of that, Jobie.
Thanks, you guys. So now there's another question from Tom for Jaime.
Sorry. I saw that one, Tom. So and Tom, I'm going to apologize because my answer is a little bit the same as it was before of, they might. They might fall under a Section 106 review, but again, it's going to depend on, are they owned by a federal agency like federal railroads, okay, or are the people who own them having to go for an approval or a permit from a federal agency to do work on that property or near that property, or that might affect that property. So, you know, like the Army Corps of Engineers, Coast Guard, federal railroads are all, actually the FCC gets involved in rail rights of way or rail property sometimes, because that's where a lot of broadband can go in. So there's a lot of different agencies that might have an involvement or have an undertaking nearby to those kinds of places that could affect them. But it's just going to depend on, is there that federal funding or is there that federal ownership? So when it comes to 106, the answer is usually maybe.
I understand. Well, I worked in our state's historic preservation office, and I wanted to tell you, I so appreciated your presentation. You gave I think the clearest idea of what Section 106 is about. When I went to work in that office, I had no idea in the beginning. And when I heard someone say that's an iced tea grant, I wondered, what are they talking about? Are they talking about the drink or something?
We love our acronyms in federal land, Tom. I'm sure you learned that the hard way too. And I probably used a million of them, and I'm sorry, everybody. It's just force of habit after 16 years. So, but thank you for that compliment. Sometimes Section 106 is clear as mud, but we try to make it interesting at least.
You definitely do. So now we have a question from Al Brunson. Al, would you like to ask your question? Are you able to unmute and do that? I think it's for Jobie. That would be my guess.
Good evening. I just wanted to know, as you start to investigate these structures and what have you, occasionally you're going to run across furniture, tools, cookware, farm implements, that kind of thing. Is there a subset of the preservation process where you're cataloging or identifying in these? And before you answer, any of you, this has been absolutely wonderful. From Mr. Stanton and the presenters on down. We really appreciate it. It saddens me also sometimes that
and my family, say for instance, we've let deterioration occur. We've taken photos, but the actual structures are gone. So I'll let you answer your question, answer my question if any of you know what the answer might be.
So yes, so in my research, I do come across other like artifacts, and it kind of depends what they are and what condition they're in. I can kind of give you kind of three, I guess, examples. So at one site, there was a chair that belonged to an enslaved woman, and she had the children that she took care of had all carved their names into the chair. And that was just within one of the buildings, and it was in, fine shape. So there really wasn't much to do with that really, but I photographed it and, documented it that way. I have also came across the family had two coverlets, like bedspreads that belonged to an enslaved woman that were made by, I think, her mother. And they were just storing those in one of the slave houses. But it was just outside, right? And just kind of like a cabinet. And so they were not being taken care of well. So I arranged for a conservator to come out and help and speak with the property owner and help him figure out how to, what was the proper way to store these. And so he did, they had a conversation, and he learned about, what was the proper way to store these, and, and he understood why. And so, the next time I went out there, they were inside, properly stored in a glass case with other quilts that his mother had kept. So that was good. And the third example is a property owner showed me she had found a few bills of sale for enslaved people in her attic. And they were in not very good condition, and she didn't really know what to do with them. So she gave them to me, and because I was doing work at Colonial Williamsburg, I knew I had access to a paper conservator. So I took them to the paper conservator, and we worked on them and got them cleaned up, and so they are now safely preserved. So yeah, so when I come across things, I do, if I know of professionals and I can connect them with the appropriate people, then I do what I can.
Thank you both. We just got one last question that I would love to take. It's for Jobie from Hong Lee. And I was wondering if you would like to unmute your computer and ask your question of Jobie directly. If you don't want to, I'm happy to ask it for you. And this will be our last question because we're just about at our time. So let me know if you'd like to ask your question live. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask it. Hong Lee says, hi, Jobie, your presentation is very interesting. For someone like me who is not very familiar with preservation projects for African-American sites and heritage, is there any website or resources for us to look up similar projects and learn more about this? I will say that I posted the link to Jobie's website, Saving Slave Houses, in the chat. So that's definitely something you should look at. And Jobie, do you have maybe one or two other ideas, or should folks start with your site?
I'd say look at I would assume the National Trust for Historic Preservation, because of their grant that they fund projects that are related to African-American history. So they're going to have something on their website about all the projects that they fund through their grant. So I think that would be a good site to start with. The National Trust for Historic Preservation. I'd also just look at maybe, like you said, the local state preservation offices to see if they have any projects happening, because a lot of places now have kind of new initiatives and are doing more projects like this. So I'd also look at just look for local projects that are happening around, and even just Googling, you know, projects in my area. You know what I mean? Seriously, like, we all love Google and a lot does come up. So, you know, just to see what's around happening locally. And that way also you can maybe go visit some of these places or actively participate in some of the work that's happening.
Thank you.
I was going to say, I know, like, I here in Maryland, and it was one of those things of, like, especially during COVID when you can't do much of anything. I know I got a chance to take advantage of some of, like, the scenic byways, and they go through the hallowed grounds route, and great to learn something new even here in your home state. So it was really special.
And there's so much you can do in front of your computer too, right? And learn about. So exactly. Yeah. Okay, well, I would just like to say a huge thank you to Mr. Stanton for sticking with us through this series, and a special thank you to Jaime Loichinger and to Jobie Hill today for being with us. I would like us to close on Al's comment about how wonderful this is. And we look forward to seeing you guys again soon. Don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if you have questions. And you'll be getting more information about future webinars soon. Wow, I just heard some big thunder. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Night, everybody.
Night.